joining us. I'd love to know, what's the profile on Tyson Miller?
Obviously we know Tyson well. We drafted him and developed him, and he made his debut here. He's turned into a really good kind of righty specialist. I mean, he really kills righties. He's got a really good slider. And, he's had some good outings with Seattle this year. He pitched pretty well. And so it made sense to grab him given, some of the bullpen injuries we've had. And I think he can really help us, definitely get out right-hand hitters.
When did you start working the phones and actually realizing, all right, we need some outside help?
Well, I think we always are. It's just, it's harder to find outside help than you think early in the season. Teams are, there's not a lot of teams out there that are shedding players. And, obviously Tyson was designated because Seattle had sort of a glut, and that allowed that to happen. But, we're always looking. There's been some guys available, but, not guys that we had particularly good projections on. And so we haven't acted. There's a difference between, we can get guys from the outside. They have to be, better than what we feel like we have internally. And, this was one where we felt like Tyson could help us more than what we had, on staff. But we have a lot of injuries right now. We just have to grind through it. We'll be looking internally. We'll be looking externally, and we'll try to be creative to get through this stretch.
Jed, when it comes to the injuries in the pen, I know you anticipate for some, but how would you describe this as a whole when you consider some of the people that you expected to be there? Merriweather with an odd injury, for example, we're still trying to figure out his status and how he fits in, and people that we bring up just because they're so missed right now, given what your situation is with your relievers.
Yeah, I always just look at, at the beginning of every season, that different things are going to happen that are unexpected, and so far, probably the biggest thing for us has been just the injuries in the bullpen in particular. And it's been a challenge. There's no question, the amount we relied on Adbert, last year and Julian last year, it was tremendous. And obviously those guys haven't been able to help us. But I just think that's just the nature of every season. You have to find ways to get through it. Some things work out great, and some things have been a struggle. And I think that the bullpen health and kind of availability has been a challenge, but we just have to work through it. And, the hope is that we get to, I don't think you ever get to a place of calm waters in particular, but I think you can get to a place of less choppy. And I think that's what we have to do right now, is just grind through this stretch while we're banged up, and hope that we can get a little bit more healthy here and get to a cleaner, to some cleaner waters. But it's been challenging, and led to a lot of conversations internally and externally. And like I said, no one's going to pause the season for us, so we just have to get through it.
And we don't have a crystal ball. Obviously, things would be a lot easier. But you mentioned something that I think is important, because we all watched the games last season, especially last September, and we know what Adbert Alzolay did. We know what, for example, Julian Merriweather did. How much of what they did last season, or the workload, do you take into how you're evaluating the next year when it comes to relievers? Because I wonder if that's something that organizations are going to have to take a bigger look at, is not just maybe a 1-year arc, but 2 years when you consider the potential for injury.
Yeah, well, I think I always just kind of say this is baseball in 2024, that these are things that, we deal with far more now than we ever used to. I think the workload is heavier on relievers because starters don't go as deep. And so I do think it's really hard. And I think you're right. I think there is no crystal ball. You have no idea, whether, Julian got hurt because he had a full workload last year, or whether he got hurt randomly, but you're totally right that you're always thinking about those things. And it's just the most volatile aspect of the team. You look at other aspects of the team, whether it's defense, whether it's offensive, players, whether it's starting pitchers, you feel like guys generally trend back to their track records in those areas. But relievers, I don't necessarily look at it that way. It's such a volatile area that, a guy can have a great season and then come back the next year and struggle. And whether it was the workload or whether it was something else, who knows? But then the opposite happens as well, where a guy can have a really, poor season and struggle, and come back the next year and be really good. And so it's a very volatile area. And, right now that volatility is hurting us, but I think that we've had a lot of success in the past, in that kind of volatile area, and we'll just keep grinding to get it right this season.
Through 6 weeks, Shota Imanaga is one of those people that people are looking at like maybe Rookie of the Year, maybe Cy Young. It's been a great start for him. Why do you think he's been successful thus far?
I think his style of pitching has translated really well. His best pitch is just a four-seam fastball. It's not tremendous velocity, but it is this tremendous ride and carry, and I think it kind of comes from a low slot, and so it plays up even more. And we had tremendous grades on his fastball in Japan, but one of the things I think has translated very well is that it's harder to pitch up in the zone in Japan. The strike zone is a little bit more east-west and not as much north-south, and so people don't really swing at those pitches up in the zone, and they're definitely not called strikes. And so I do think that he has a fastball that allows him to pitch up in the zone really effectively. I think that actually is probably more effective here than it was in Japan. And then we've kind of increased the usage of his splitter, and that's not a pitch that a lot of people throw over here, especially lefties. And so I just think that it's a look that is very effective here and hasn't been seen by a lot of people here. And so I think that's really allowed him to transition well. And there are certain games when he barely uses his curveball or barely uses his sweeper, and those are pretty good pitches. I mean, the curveball is a pretty good get me over pitch, and the slider is a good pitch to lefties. But there've been plenty of games where he barely had to use those pitches because the four seamer and the splitter have been really effective. So a lot of credit to him for being willing to make adjustments and being just open-minded to everything. And the other thing is he competes really hard. I mean, I thought, last night was a really good test for him. He's facing a really good Braves team. He had a matchup with, a couple big matchups with Ozuna. He had a bases loaded at bat with Acuna, and he doesn't back down. He pumps strikes. He competes, and I think that's really helped him. He hasn't sort of backed away from any of these fights, so to speak, with the really good players, and I think that really aided his success.
I feel like when I'm watching him, and obviously there's the recency bias of last night's start, that I'm watching a guy that works north, south, east, and west, and I feel like that's one of the things that's helping him be effective. He just seems like a guy who knows how to pitch. How do you guys quantify that? Like, what are the things that you're looking for when determining not just pitch shape or pitch velo, but a guy understanding how to put all of it together?
Well, I do think that the pitching coaches and the catchers deserve credit too for working with him, and I think having a good mix and having a good feel. But I agree, his command scores are very good, and I think that's a lot of what you're talking about is his ability to have a lengthy at bat with someone and continue to throw strikes, not just with a four seamer, but being willing to throw, a splitter in 3-2 and when he's down in the count and stuff like that. And I mean, he's pitched for a long time in Japan really effectively, and I think that, he's not I know you talk about Rookie of the Year. He's not a young pitcher. He's 30 and he's made a lot of big starts in Japan and pitched a lot of big games. And so I do think there's a level of know-how. And he's really bright. I mean, I think you can tell that in his interviews. You can tell that, the way he pitches, the way he prepares. He's a bright guy, and I think that adds to his ability on the mound.
We're talking with Jed Hoyer on the Bernstein Holmes Show. Layla Rahimi is in on this Tuesday instead of her usual Wednesday. We heard Dansby Swanson yesterday. We played it on the show discussing about how he was convinced that he needed some time off, and he used the word dumb. He said that he was finally convinced that this was dumb to keep playing through this, and as much as he wants to play, sometimes you have to make some sacrifices. And I'm just picturing it must take a village. Like, who actually pulls him aside in whose office or who's in his locker who finally gets through to him, and how coordinated does the effort have to be? Like, hey, you tell him he's hurt. No, you tell him he's hurt. How does this work?
Yeah, well, I think there's a number of conversations to your point. I bumped into him in the hallway and we talked for quite a while, and then he came in Craig's office later and, they talked, and then another conversation when all of us were in there. And I think with a player like Dansby, it's different than most in the sense that he really prides himself on being available every day. Obviously, I think he played all but 2 games his last 3 years in Atlanta. And I know last year when he went on the IL, that was really hard. And it's a very difficult thing in general, trying to find that balance between playing banged up and being out there and helping the team win versus, when you need to break because you're going to continue to get worse. You're not going to help the team that much, and you're not going to get back to health later on. And so that was really the thought with Dansby when he was struggling to play. And also, we want him at, 90+% of who he is. And, we're early in the season. It's May. It just made sense. It felt like grinding through it he was just not going to get better, enough to do it. And in general, I think that's one of the hardest aspects of, managing a team from a roster standpoint over the length of the season is that it's easy to say, well, of course, he's playing banged up, sit him down right away. But at any one time, there's probably 12 to 15 guys on the injury report. Like everyone's dealing with something. And so trying to figure out which things are going to be truly limiting, which things are going to sort of get better as you play, and which things require you to go on the IL and sit out. It's a challenging thing because we don't have an unlimited roster of guys to go get. So, I'll use Morel as an example. Like we talked about that with him early in the season. It felt like he was jammed a couple of times. It felt like his hands were bothering him a little bit. He was struggling. And I was like, do we sit him out and put him in the IL right now, or do we keep playing him through it? And I don't feel like there's ever a great answer to those things, to be candid. It's really, really challenging to try to figure those out. But in the case of Dansby, this seemed obvious that, we need him having the range he normally does. We need him able to have a good base at the plate and, taking 10 days or 2 weeks, hopefully off and resting. I think it should aid us the rest of the season.
Jed, to add to that, I think that the way the organization has managed Jameson Taillon this year speaks to this decision. And we even see his schedule change a little bit over the weekend. He ends up being the starter tonight. What do you think of how you guys were able to address his injury as a whole, and then just recently trying to tinker and figure out where he's at with what he needs? And again, a good measuring stick with this team he's facing in the Braves. Yeah.
Yeah. And his injuries have been, I don't know, minimize them, but, they've been, nagging in nature. He's dealt with the lower back issue in spring training, and then obviously dealt with it a lesser amount now. Thankfully, we have some depth in that area right now, knock on wood, and we were able to slide guys in and move him back in the rotation. But that's a good example that, if we, in a different scenario where we didn't have Kyle to come back from the IL, we might have had to put him on the IL right there, even though we knew it was a short injury, because that's how you have to manage your roster. So in this particular case, we were able to back him up because we had some depth available. But those are hard, especially with pitching now with a 15-day IL, to put a guy in the IL with something that is only one start can be frustrating. But if it negatively impacts the bullpen and negatively impacts the rest of the starters, that's often what you have to do. Luckily, in this case, we weren't forced to do that.
Jed, how would you say Christopher Morel has evolved as a hitter?
I thought his at-bat in the ninth last night was like maybe his best at-bat of the year. I just thought, that kind of battle in that situation, laying off the pitches he laid off of, but still being aggressive. I mean, he's still trying to homer. He's still trying to hit the ball really hard, but his decision-making has really gotten better and better. And I think what we're watching, if he can continue to make decisions at this rate, I just think we're looking at a guy that's emerging as a elite slugger. The new Statcast stuff came out the other day, and I think he's in the top 5 or 6 in terms of, bat speed in the game. We know how hard he hits the ball. If now he makes good decisions at the plate and takes his walks and forces the pitchers into the zone, I think the sky's the limit in terms of number of homers he can hit as it warms up here this summer. So, yeah, we're watching something that's pretty exciting, and I think that, he had that lull, whether it was because he was banged up or whether it was because he was struggling. but he's starting to come out of it. And, yeah, it's pretty exciting to watch. And I would add that I think his defense has gotten better and better. There was times in spring where he struggled with his throwing, but he's gotten more and more consistent over there. And I think that's the most important thing in the infield is just the ability to convert, routine plays into outs is so critical. And we're definitely a better team offensively if we can put him at third. So it's been a pretty exciting year of developments. And I don't think all of those developments have yet kind of manifested in terms of his numbers. But I think if he continues to do this, I think we're going to watch his numbers just pop as the summer goes on.
You mentioned the Statcast bat tracking data that has had some of us all abuzz. What were your takeaways from that being released to the public?
I was kind of still digging into it, I think it's fascinating, full stop. That part's great. I just think some of the takeaways, I think we have to be careful, we don't overanalyze some of these things right away. I think we're still digging into, what's valid and what's not valid. But I do think that some of the things are, as you'd expect, right? That Luis Ariz has the most accurate barrel, that makes sense, or that Stanton has the most bat speed. It just makes sense. And some of the guys that can combine those things are the really special hitters. But yeah, it's interesting to look at, and I think we'll continue to dig into it and see if we can come up with some really good insights.
I lost my bet, Jed, because I said before you came on, I said for going back years, I said anytime I ask a Cubs baseball executive about some new stat or new metric or new information, the response I always get is some degree of condescension of, well, we've had our own proprietary version of that for years now, so this really isn't new to us. You're saying this is kind of new to you?
So I just think hitting stuff in general is fascinating because I think as an industry, we right now have a pretty good sense of what the ball is doing when it leaves the pitcher's hand. And how we evaluate pitchers, I think we got to Imanaga as a good example. We had his fastball as elite in Japan, and we had it as elite in the WBC. And so the fact that it doesn't surprise me at all that that's converted really well over here, that his fastball plays really well here. You know why? Because it's really good, and we can see that pretty clearly with the pitch tracking stuff we have. The hitting stuff I think is fascinating because we have so much hitting information through our proprietary stuff. We're getting more and more of that stuff, through Statcast. But it's also, I think we're a ways away in terms of being able to use it to determine who are the best hitters. Sometimes I'll look at a hitter and he'll have very average metrics across the board, whether it's in things we measure in terms of how the hinge angle of the bat, and try to measure timing, and you try to measure bat speed and all these different things. But sometimes decision making may well be the thing that stands out about that player, and that's not a swing related thing at all. And so hitting there's a lot more layers to figuring out who's a good hitter and how it translates than just what the guy's doing mechanically. So anyway, it's just, sorry to go on a tangent.
No. This is great. So if you could measure something right now, if you had a magic wand and said, if only we could measure this, what would you measure?
I think I'd probably, the unknown part of it is the decision making and the eyesight and how it translates to the brain and making the decisions in milliseconds, right? That ultimately is that's the hardest part of it, right? The swing mechanics are very important. If you're looking at a guy who's 2 inches under plane, I can probably tell you what his errors are going to be in terms of as a hitter. So yes, the swing mechanics part is really important, but what is happening, behind the guy's eyes and with the guy's eyes is also unbelievably important. So I think you could have a hitter who you don't think he has a particularly great swing. You don't think he has a ton of bat speed, but he's a really effective offensive player because he makes such good decisions on what he swings at, what he doesn't swing at. And so I just think it's a lot more complicated than what is your bat speed. I think that it's or even just what is your swing doing, because there's a lot more to it. Whereas I do think that, and I'm not trying to simplify pitching, but I do think that if a guy has a plus fastball and a plus slider, at some level, those guys are usually pretty effective. Whereas a guy who has the most bat speed may not actually be that effective.